everyone, and welcome back to Between Two Worlds. I am your host, Annika, and very excitingly, my bi weekly intros are going to get a little bit longer because I am going to have a new plug. And really, I'm super, super juiced up to talk about my Patreon. I've really, put a lot of effort and love into it, and it's this driving force of inspiration, especially right now with all the love that it has been getting. So, thank you to everyone who has already checked it out. I will add a link and a handle in the description, but really quickly, I just want to talk about the three tiers that I have set up. The first one, I am going to do monthly Q&A and access to polls for either Patreon content or here on the podcast, access to the community space around Patreon, and a tarot card or some sort of divination breakdown deep dive every single month. And then the second tier, we are going to do obviously everything from the first tier, plus either a plant, a spirit, a deity, a total deep dive and breakdown there. In addition to folklore and belief pattern breakdowns, I really want to cover a lot of folklore. Just a little heads up, I think for this very first month in February, we're going to be talking about the Leshy, but when it comes to the belief pattern breakdowns, we're going to talk about the religious deconstruction and, deep dive into that sort of stuff. And then also recipes. So either this is going to be some kitchen witchery or charms, sigils, oils, powders, really anything that has really a recipe to. And then the third tier finally is going to be all that plus a monthly designed ritual or spell. Then, of course, with the third tier as well, we are going to do a necromancy deep dive. And really, this is going to range from anything that falls within the necromancy space, which I believe is still going to be sort of like an audio essay style. But yeah, so please go ahead and go check it out. February is where we launch everything, but I officially set up the tiers. So thanks again. And let's talk about this episode today. So we are going to go back to, between two worlds basics and talk about this lovely dichotomy that we see of witches and their gods. And really, I want to talk about outsourcing your energy when it comes to specifically working with petitioning and, yes, even praying to deities or gods and saints. Spirits is a little bit different here just because I personally have been working with certain spirits for a very long time, but I'm going to include it in today's conversation. So, really, the one thing that I can't say is that, I was a devout Christian for many years and, then flipped to witchcraft. That's just not true. My trauma is different. Fear was pressed into me as a child because of really my natural obsession with anything magical. And I always fought the idea of Christianity being forced upon me. It felt like being the rope in a game of tug of war, but that decision I made to take the crooked path instead, really came early for me. Not without its own struggles, but still pretty early. So, as I've grown into this space, the online occult space, I should say, I've noticed that witches who have left an organized religion usually split in one of two directions. Some of us run towards the gods, towards this structure, this ritual, devotion, towards something that feels like the container that you might have lost, but on our own terms this time. And there is comfort in that, after so much rupture, having something to orient towards, something bigger than yourself that actually wants a relationship with you, can feel like a relief for these witches. Then others go the opposite direction. No gods, no masters, no kneeling, anything that smells like hierarchy, anything that asks for devotion or deference, anything that echoes the old system, it's out. It's a hard no, never again, and it starts to feel like a threat. And really, I've been there. This is where I was for a really long time, besides my spirit work, which naturally I just separated in my head because I thought, well, spirits are different. It's a relationship. It really stemmed from the animism that I practice. But I was too inexperienced, or I should say naive, to know that it's the same for the big word deities as well. And then later came the saints. And here's the thing, both of these responses make a complete sense. right? Both are valid, both come from somewhere real. And this episode isn't here to tell you which one is correct. I'm not interested in convincing you to work with deities or saints if it's not your path. What I am interested in is what's underneath these choices. Because when we leave religion, we don't stop relating to power. We don't stop encountering these forces that are larger than ourselves. It's really just in human nature, but we just renegotiate how those relationships work. So, for a lot of witches, especially those of us carrying religious trauma, that renegotiation shows up most clearly in how we feel about deities, saints, spirits, and really intermediaries. Whether we reach for them or refuse them, whether they feel like liberation or like a trap we barely escaped, that's what we're going to be digging into today. This is not theology, it's not belief, but really I want to dissect and pull apart, why we choose or refuse these relationships and what those choices reveal about power, energy, and healing. Because at the end of the day, I believe this is what makes you a better witch, especially if you're working through that religious trauma. So, when we get to breaking down today's conversation, I want to talk about the energetics of witchcraft, what it pertains to you using your own energy for spells and really all of your magical workings, and what happens when you try to fuel everything yourself. We're going to talk about authority, nervous system regulation, sustainability, and really just the plain fact that, witches don't stop relating to power after they leave religion. That's not what happens. What happens is we have that renegotiation of how to relate to it. And it's not intellectual, it's not a decision you make with your mind and then it's settled. It's more somatic. It's survival based, it lives in your body, the way you flinch or don't flinch when someone mentions a prayer, or the way your chest tightens or doesn't when you see an image of a saint, the way devotion sounds like love to some people and like a leash to really others. So let's just dive right into talking about these two paths. First path is full devotion, almost too quick. It's this total immersion. Some newly found witches leaving their church might actually just be looking for a quote, better God to follow. But in my humble ass opinion, that is not the point of witchcraft. Not at first. It is much deeper than that. It's messy, really messy journey of self analysis, self discovery, this uprooting of the ugliest parts of yourself to really, in the end, find your true power and your authenticity. Um, Besides all the fun, actual witchcraft practice part of it. And this is the witch who finds, paganism or polytheism or even Wicca or some kind of deity centered space or practice, and they just dive right in hard. There's altars everywhere, daily devotionals, offerings, prayers, the whole thing. And of course, that makes sense when you've lost a structure that organized your entire life, like your mornings, your rituals, your sense of meaning, your community. There's a hole there. And the nervous system doesn't love holes, it wants containment, it wants to know where the edges are. So finding this new structure, this new container, really a new relationship with something bigger than yourself, that can feel, of course, like coming home. It can regulate the nervous system in ways that are genuinely healing. And there's comfort in having something to orient towards. And there's intimacy in devotion. There's this relief in not being alone in the universe. But of course, there is a shadow side to this. Sometimes that devotion isn't really about the gods, it's about outsourcing authority again. It's about finding someone else to tell you what to do, what's right, what's wrong, how to live, because making those decisions yourself is terrifying. And sometimes the old obedience patterns just find a new mask. The names change, but the dynamic really doesn't. And you trade one hierarchy for another, and really are just calling it freedom because this time you chose it. And that's not really a criticism, it's really a pattern to watch for. And devotion can be genuine and healthy, of course. We see this all the time um, in folk practice and lots of witchcraft spaces. And it can really also be a way to avoid the harder work of self trust. And of course, this goes beyond just whether you devote your time to a god or not. But That's besides the point. So let's talk about the second path. And this is the total rejection, the radical sovereignty. And really, this is the witch who just says, never again, no gods, no masters, no kneeling. I don't need anyone or anything outside of myself. I am my own authority. And of course, I get that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have your own authority, right? But it feels like you're giving it away. So, personally, I did live there for a long time when you've been burned by a system that demanded your submission, that punished your questions, that used your devotion against you. The last thing you want is to sign up for another version of that. And rejecting this hierarchy feels like survival. Refusing to kneel feels like dignity. And building a practice that relies on nothing but your own power finally feels like being safe. And of course, there's wisdom in that. And boundary repair is sacred work in learning to trust yourself after a system taught you not to. But there's a pretty deep shadow side to this one, too. And that sovereignty is actually isolation, kind of wearing a costume. The I don't need anyone is just dressed up as I'm too scared to trust again. And sometimes the refusal work or the refusal to work with anything outside of yourself isn't empowerment, it's exhaustion just waiting to happen. So I really have found that human energy is finite, especially on this path of being a witch and using energy to manipulate and um, not manipulate in a bad way, but we manipulate energetics to really achieve what we want. That's what we do through spells and rituals. And you cannot power everything from your own tank forever. And when burnout hits, and it will, it doesn't mean your magic has failed. It means you were trying to sustain something alone that was never meant to be carried just by one person. And of course, I've hit this personally when I wasn't specifically asking for a spirit for help. So, like when I would try to do a spell or ritual specifically for myself with myself, I wasn't going to my house spirit, or I wasn't going to a specific ancestor, or I wasn't involving some sort of plant spirit. Um, this is when I noticed heavy burnout, even if it was just like one working that I did, because it was all on me. And at the time, I still didn't have a grasp on um, learning how to recharge my energy. I knew how to center and ground and all that good stuff, but when it came to learning to recharge my energy and to keep myself within this field of protection, but also learning to use my energy, it just was completely unsustainable. So if you are fresh out of a religion, like recently left, still shaky, still figuring out who you are without that structure, of course, I need to be honest with you. This is not where you start, right? You don't start immediately by worshiping a new god. And I know that's not the sexy answer, but I know there's a temptation when you leave religion to immediately fill a hole with something else, especially in the world of like Instagram and TikTok. And I'm sure it's very tempting to just look at everyone else's practices and be like, yeah, I would way rather do that and worship this cool ass god instead of this one. But it's not all what it's cracked out to be if you don't do the work first. So, really, do the hard part, and that is just sitting with yourself. The hard part is asking, who am I without the system that told me who to be? What do I actually believe? Not what I was told to believe and not what I'm rebelling against. And that's a big one there. But what's actually mine? What do you value? What do you want? What kind of relationship with power do you actually want to have? And these, of course, aren't quick questions, and they don't get answered in a weekend. They don't get answered by buying a new tarot deck or setting up an altar to a deity you found again on TikTok. Sorry for all the TikTok hate, but I am respectfully a TikTok hater. Anyway, they get answered slowly, messily, painfully over time through journaling and therapy and shadow work and sitting in the discomfort of not knowing. And this is the work for the work. You know, I'm not saying this to gatekeep either. I'm not saying you have to earn your way to a deity or to deity work in general or to prove you're healed enough to petition a saint. That's not it at all. I'm saying that if you skip this part, you're going to bring all of your unexamined stuff into these relationships. And that's where it starts to get messy. Because really, what happens is when you don't do the self discovery work first, you end up recreating this. The old dynamic with new names, and you find a deity and you make them your new authority figure, and you find a tradition in that you want to follow, and it's just as rigid as you followed the old one, and you trade one set of rules for another and call it freedom because the aesthetics are different. Or you go again the other direction and you're rejecting that everything so hard that you cut yourself off from the support that you actually need. And you make independence your new religion. You worship your own autonomy so fiercely that you can't receive help. You can't soften in or let anything in. So both of these are trauma responses, wearing this spiritual clothing. Now, the actual work is getting to know yourself well enough that you can enter relationships with power from a place of choice and not reaction. It's learning your own patterns, your own triggers, your own tendencies, and the ways you give yourself away. The ways you wall yourself off and the things you do when you're scared. And it's the stories that you start to tell yourself about what you might deserve. And that's not glamorous, right? It doesn't look good on Instagram. Nobody's posting about the 6 months they spent in therapy unpacking their religious trauma before they felt ready to approach a deity. That is the stuff that happens in silence. And that really is what makes the difference between, a witch who's just performing a new identity and a witch who's actually transforming. So, what does this actually look like in practice? Let me give you some real tangible things. Of course, first, meditation. I'm a huge meditation advocate, and I don't mean always guided meditations where someone tells you what to visualize. I mean, this is the harder meditation where you sit in silence with yourself and you're not reaching for a tool. There's no cards, no pendulum, no spirit communication, just you. Learning to tolerate the discomfort of your own mind without immediately trying to fix it or escape it or get an answer from somewhere else. And now this is foundational. If you can't sit with yourself, then you're not ready to sit with a deity. And you can utilize journaling too, but specifically for unpacking this religious conditioning. Not just how do I feel today? I'm talking about prompts like, what was I taught about obedience? What was I told would happen if I questioned this authority? Or even memories of what did happen when you questioned something. And what did prayer feel like in my body as a child? I remember prayer felt amazing. Actually, my dad would sit with me before bed every single night and uh, have me repeat the Lord's Prayer and the Lord's Prayer then in Hebrew with him every single night before we went to bed. And it was very comforting to me because not only was it being told to me by my father, but I had this image of this God protecting me. I had built this image of a certain spirit and deity watching over me that I started to build a relationship with. And that's another thing that my dad has always said too, is it doesn't matter um, what religion you fall under, especially when I was finding myself in witchcraft and I was, oh, I'm not Christian and all this stuff, and I don't follow that. And he said, it doesn't matter. It just matters. What matters is your personal relationship with God. That's it. No matter what God meant for you. So, really asking these questions will crack you open if you let them in. And they'll show you exactly where the old programming is still running. Just as I have good memories of praying, I have really bad memories of praying as well. And, this is something that took a lot of looking at. So, and then I want to talk about body-based practices. Now, this one is a little bit harder for me. Um, and it was just a lot harder to start and to get through. But practices for noticing where you actually hold religious trauma. That one is a big one because it's not just in your mind, it's in your biology. Pay attention to what happens in your body when you hear certain words like God, prayer, devotion, surrender. Do your shoulders tighten? Does your jaw clench? Does your stomach drop? Does your chest close. Your body remembers things your conscious mind has forgotten, and learning to listen to those signals is part of reclaiming yourself. Then, learning to hear your own intuition before you try to hear spirits. This one is huge, and I really want to talk about this more when it comes to other episodes focused solely on communicating with spirits. But so many witches want to or try to jump straight into spirit communication without ever learning to distinguish their own inner voice from external output. And, they can't tell if they're hearing a spirit or hearing their own fear or hearing their own wishful thinking. And of course, this gets super muddy if you go really too far into it. But, spend time with your intuition first. Learn what your yes feels like, learn what your no feels like, and learn what your own wisdom sounds like before you start trying to tune into somebody else's frequency. Now, working with elements in nature before working with entities is another one. This is, of course, old foundational craft. Sitting with fire, with water, putting your hands in the dirt, feeling the wind. Learn to sense energy in its most basic forms before you start working with complex intelligences. The elements don't have agendas, they don't trigger your religious trauma. They're a safe place to practice opening, sensing, and closing. And they teach you the basics of energetic relationship without the loaded baggage. Now, this might be a really, really niche example, but I ride motorcycles, and basically, when I started riding, I started off on a 300cc. Basically, it's like just a smaller motorcycle, because really, what you want to do when you start on a smaller bike is focus on not dying, right? You are focusing on learning the basics of learning how to ride and learning how to uh, maneuver around on the streets before you get on something larger. Then you can focus on the power of the engine and the power of the actual motorcycle. So, besides that, using divination as self reflection rather than this external guide. So, when you pull cards, try not immediately asking, what are the spirits telling me? Or what is spirit telling me? What is the universe telling me? And start to shift the questions and the perspective to, what is this showing me about myself? And you can really shift the way you use divination into this mirror and not an oracle. And learning to read your own patterns and your own shadows, your own blind spots. The cards are a tool for self knowledge first. External guidance can come later, but once you know yourself well enough to discern what's yours and what isn't, that's where things start to get really, really useful. So, this, of course, is the work before the work, and it's not going to be fast, but it builds this foundation that can actually hold something. And sorry to burst your bubble, but this part never ends. It's not like you do your self-discovery phase and you're done and now you get to do the fun stuff. It's ongoing, it's constantly ongoing. And really, you can do the fun stuff at the same time, but you keep learning yourself, you keep updating, and you keep growing. And really, when we talk about the trauma versus the discernment, trauma doesn't evolve. Trauma stays frozen, but you can evolve. Your discernment can evolve, and your capacity for relationship can evolve. And the things that were a hard no 5 years ago might be a curious maybe now. And the things that felt impossible start to feel accessible, not because you forced it, but because you did the work and you changed. So, if you're listening to this and you're fresh out of religion and you're feeling the pull towards deities or saints or some kind of spiritual relationship, I'm, of course, not saying don't do it. I'm saying check in with yourself first. Ask why you want it, ask why or what you're hoping it will give you, and ask if you're looking for a relationship or more of a rescue situation. And if the answer is complicated, that's okay. That's actually really good. It's supposed to be complicated. Just don't skip the part where you sit with the complication, and don't rush past the discomfort to get the new altar or the new statue. The altar will still be there when you're ready, and the gods aren't going anywhere. The saints have been around for centuries. They can wait for you to do your work. So you are the foundation of your practice. If that foundation is shaky, everything you build on top of it will be shaky too. Build yourself first, get to know the witch before you start handling her responsibilities, or him, or them, whatever. You know what I mean? And then when you do approach those relationships with deities, with saints, with spirits, with ancestors, you'll be approaching them as someone who knows who they are and someone who can say yes and mean it, and someone who can say no and trust it. And really, someone who isn't looking to be saved but is ready to collaborate. And really, you'll get a lot better results um, with these spirits and deities if that is the case. Now, when it comes to my story, of course, I could talk theory all day, but the truth is, my relationship with deities didn't start with research or curiosity or some intellectual decision to be open. It started with grief, and it started with Hecate, which I think I told this story before, but well, I'm going to tell it again. So, my dog Titus was dying, and this dog, oh my God, he was everything to me. He was my soul dog. I got him when I was very, very young. Did everything with him. He helped me through lots of stuff. My parents' divorce and moving and so much. Anyway, he was my soul dog. And when I knew that I was going to have to induce his passing at the pet hospital, I started looking for something, for someone to help, not for me, but for him. And I needed to know he would be led somewhere, that he wouldn't just stop, that there would be something on the other side waiting for him. And really at this point in my journey, I know it doesn't just stop, right? But it was this weird fear that just hit me. So I did. I went looking for a deity or a spirit who could specifically help his soul cross. And of course, I found Hecate being a psychopomp and the dogs and all of her history and legends. But at this point, I still had all of my walls up about working with gods and all the things I had told myself that it was too close to what I thought was worshiping a god, like praying to our Lord and Heavenly Father. It looked the same to me that, I didn't need it and that wasn't for me. It was definitely still the shadow I didn't touch with a 10-foot pole. But in that moment, none of that mattered. I put it all aside for him, all of my fears, all of my rules, everything I had told myself about working with gods. I set it down all in hopes that, he would be led to where he needed to be. And then the moment came. He was at the pet hospital. His head was in my lap. He was looking up at me, and I prayed. Like, I actually prayed. I had a whole petition that I spent time on, and I had no idea if she would actually come forward, especially from all the information you get on her on the internet. But, I asked her, I asked Hecate to lead him, to take him and show him the way, and she did. So I closed my eyes with Titus as he passed, and I felt her. I saw her. She descended down the stairway. Everything was black and dark besides her torch and the glow from it. And she looked at me with this, a deep understanding and sorrow, and she was more than happy to lead him for me. And mind you, at this point, it was like literally just me and Titus in the room. I didn't want anyone else in there with me. Uh, but her two dogs were there. I saw the two black dogs, and they bounced towards Titus, and he was excited to see other pups. And he looked at me like, you're going to be okay. Can I go? And then he did, he left with them. And from that moment on, I have always honored her for him, for what she did for me. Since then, she has come to me, of course, in other reasons. And, we have worked closely together in other ways and still a deity that I love to reach out to. And when she comes forward for me, um, it's a very special relationship now, of course, but that is how it started. And I really started to figure out that it's not worship in the way that I was taught to fear. It's reciprocal. It's built on a moment of trust when really I had nothing left to give but my fear and my love. And that was my door opening really to the gods and the deities. Of course, I have heard of them and maybe even worked with things you could argue as deities like um, Pan or the moon or whatever, that's a whole nother conversation. But then just recently, like in the past year probably, I started to work with Saint Expedite. Now, I'm gonna be honest, this one scared the shit out of me because I was like, Saints, what the fuck? I didn't even like have any experience when it came to Catholicism. Of course, my family was Christian and it was a whole thing and it seemed closer. It was more loaded, but I kept hearing his name in witchcraft spaces and I read about him. I got a couple books and I became more and more curious and kept seeing him come up in folk magic traditions. Now, Saint Expedite has a long history with witches and conjure workers. He's not just a church saint, he's a spirit who has been worked with outside of doctrine for a long, long time. And he's known for fast results and really much more than that. But that might be for a whole another dedicated episode on really his own. But for a bit of history on Saint Expedite, because it's really fascinating. And of course, he's opened me up to wanting to work with other saints. And it's made me realize that these saints aren't just some church label on them, but they are spirits that have been, uh, worked with and worshipped and talked to and fed for centuries and centuries from millions of people. So while specifically Saint Expedite's origins are disputed, like really genuinely murky, I think the more I wanted to learn about him, the more questions I had. But there's a legend, probably apocryphal, but I love it anyway, that a crate of relics arrived at a convent in Paris, and then the nuns didn't know which saint the relics belonged to, and the crate was marked expedite, meaning rush or urgent, of course, in shipping terms, and supposedly they mistook the shipping label for the saint's name. Is that true? Probably not, but the fact that this story exists tells you something about how Expedite operates. He's liminal, he's a little chaotic, and he exists in the cracks. Now, what we do know is that his veneration exploded in New Orleans, particularly in the late 1800s, and he became deeply embedded in New Orleans voodoo and hoodoo traditions. Conjure workers, root doctors, and folk magicians adopted him when he was worked. He was fast. He cut through obstacles. He didn't require you to be a good Catholic or follow doctrine. He required you to hold up your end of the bargain, and that was it. He is a businessman, and he's associated with speed, urgency, and overcoming procrastination and delays. And his iconography usually shows him holding a cross that says "Hodie," or I think that's how I say it, which is Latin for today, while stomping on a crow or raven that says "cross," meaning tomorrow. And the message is clear: don't put it off, do it now. He's the saint of getting shit done. And of course, that whole thing has a story of its own. The devil came to him in the form of a crow, or sometimes even, I think some stories say snake, and was beckoning him to put off converting to Christianity by one more day. And he said, no, I will be a Christian today. And so, really, what I've learned to love about him is he's transactional in the best way. You ask, you receive, you pay. It's clean, it's clear. There's no groveling, there's no, am I worthy enough? No waiting to be chosen. You approach him with respect, you make your petition, and you promise your offering. And if he delivers, you deliver. That's it, that's the relationship. Of course, I've seen that he's appreciated having an altar, and he does have a permanent altar in my space now. So I took that jump. I got the statue, and I have uh, began that relationship. I started that relationship actually before I petitioned him. I just felt like it was the respectful thing to do. But besides keeping the relationship open, like, giving him gratitude offerings like water, crow feathers I find, coins, homemade bread and goods when I make them, and of course pound cake, but that's usually for the barters and boons. But honestly, it's fucking awesome. I love working with him. It's really molded into a whole new feeling within my craft to use this saint and to have a relationship with this saint who was literally martyred for being Christian for my witchcraft. I just, it's fucking awesome. I love it. But the point is, I didn't come to deities or saints because I figured out the right theology. I came to them because I needed help, because I was willing to set down my fear for something that mattered more. And because, when I did, that relationship was real. That's what I want you to hear. Not that you should work with gods or saints, but that if fear is the only thing that is stopping you, it might be worth asking what's on the other side of it. You really just might be crippling your magic without knowing it, without knowing how much more effective it really can be. So now let's talk about the energetic standpoint, because I think a lot of the confusion and fear around working with deities or these saints comes from not understanding what they do. We get caught up in, do I believe in this or is this too religious? When the question is, what is the relationship for? What does it do? So let me break it down. Break it like the way I think about it. These beings, these deities, saints, spirits, ancestors, they're not objects of belief. They're not things you have to accept on faith or reject on principle. They're energetic infrastructure. They're these currents, these lenses, these anchors, and really specialists that, the question isn't, do you believe? The question is, what does this do and how does it move energy? And maybe this is kind of like the chaos magic perspective in me of if it fucking works, it works. So let's start with the deities. Deities are big, right? They carry large archetypal forces or literal intelligent beings, no matter how you believe in them. When you work with a deity, you're plugging into something ancient, something that has been shaped by thousands of years of human relationship and attention, these pantheons that have just existed. And they're not quick fixes. Deity work is long term relationship work, usually, and it's slow building, it shapes over time. Now, saints occupy this really unique space because they're human scaled, right? They were once people, which means they understand human problems in a way that big archetypal forces sometimes don't, and they're culturally embedded. They come from specific places, from specific histories and communities, and they're energetically specific. Saints are specialists. You don't go to Saint Expedite for the same thing you'd go to Saint Martha for. They have their lanes. And I think one of the driving forces for me when it came to actually taking that step and working with a saint for the first time was understanding that working with this saint was not the same thing as being Catholic. The church might have curated saints, but it didn't invent their power. Folk magic traditions have been working with saints outside of doctrine for centuries, which really I kept my eyes closed to. I didn't understand this until I really looked into it. Hoodoo, conjure, brujeria, Italian folk magic. Saints show up in all of these practices not because the practitioners were devout Catholics, but because saints worked. They got results. They were accessible. They were practical and less energetically taxing than trying to petition some massive cosmic force for help with your rent. And then, of course, there's the church. So, spirits. Let's just talk about regular spirits, and I mean spirits in the broader sense, land spirits, plant spirits, house spirits, spirits of place. These are local, they are relational, they are already around you whether you acknowledge them or not. Working with spirits is often about tuning into what's already there and building reciprocity with it. And it's less about calling something in and more about recognizing what's already present, which really, I don't think I would be able to function too well without all the spirit work that I have done and really do without even noticing at this point. It becomes very ingrained and it really blurs the line with animism. Well, I guess I would argue there is no line there because I have always been an animist. So, really, as a child, I loved to commune with the spirit of all things, whether it was a rock, a tree, a stream, or so on and so forth. But I digress. Maybe I'm itching to do a spirit work or animism episode. That seems like a recurring theme here. But then there's ancestors, which are, of course, already invested in you. They have skin in the game. Your success is their success. Your healing is their healing. And ancestor work is some of the most accessible and sustainable magic you can do because you're not trying to get attention of something far away. You're deepening a connection that already exists. They are the ones that immediately have your back. They know you, they know your family patterns, your struggles, your gifts, and they want to help. Now, here's the key point. None of these are superior to the others. Deities aren't higher than ancestors. Saints aren't lesser than gods. They serve different energetic functions, and they're tools in a toolbox, relationships in a network. And of course, the witch's job isn't to rank them or pick the best one. The witch's job is to know what each one does and work with them accordingly. You're not submitting to any of these. You're conducting, you're directing, rounding, opening, and closing with intention. And that's the difference between religious devotion and witchcraft. You're not on your knees waiting for it to be told what to do. You're in a relationship and really you're steering. So let's talk about the big energy problem. And I mean this in the most practical, non-woo-woo way possible, because there's a lot of witches who get stuck, and it's where a lot of burnout comes from. You only have so much energy, right? So let's go back to talking about this. Your body only produces so much. And if you're someone who has experienced trauma, well, let's be honest, it's most of us, your capacity is even shorter. Trauma lives in the body. It takes up resources. It makes your baseline already lower than someone who hasn't been through what you've been through. But when you try to power your entire magical practice from your own personal tank, you run out. You hit this wall, you burn out, and then you start to think something is wrong with you. You start to think that your magic isn't working, you've lost your gift, or you're not cut out for this. Or I've even seen people be ridiculous and be like, oh, witchcraft doesn't work. It's like, okay, well, obviously, because you're not working the witchcraft. Anyway, but that's not what is happening. What's happening is you're trying to fuel something alone that was really never meant to be sustained by personal will alone. This is the trap of just use your own energy. It sounds empowering, it sounds sovereign, that I don't need anything outside myself. I source my own power. And while there's truth in that, you are powerful, your energy does matter. But the idea is that you should be able to do everything yourself, that relying on anything outside yourself is weakness or dependency or giving away your power. And that's not this ancient wisdom. That's like hustle culture wearing a pentacle. Historically, witches didn't do this. They did not try to power everything from their own bodies. They worked relationally. They channeled, they borrowed, they negotiated, they grounded forces larger than themselves and directed them with skill, right? It's like the oldest image in the book of a witch communing with a giant force and using its power. And really, that is what this episode is about. To break the stigma of gods and saints specifically, that all witches manipulate and move energy. It's the fucking point. But think about all the folk magic traditions full of this. You call on an ancestor, you work with a plant spirit, you draw down the moon, you invite something in, or you send your request out. The witch is that conduit, not the generator. Skill was never about how much you could endure. It was about regulation, about timing and that discernment, knowing when to draw on your own reserves and when to borrow momentum from something bigger. And, here's the other piece. Your personal energy is inconsistent, right? It fluctuates with your mood, your health, your sleep, your stress levels, your menstrual cycle, if you have one, your mental health. Some days you're full, some days you're running on empty. And if your magic only works when you're at peak capacity, well, that's just not sustainable. That's not a practice. That's a performance you can only maintain when conditions are perfect. But when you work relationally, when you have relationships with spirits, ancestors, deities, and saints, you have access to energy that isn't dependent on whether you slept well last night. You have support that doesn't disappear when you're depressed or sick or grieving. And that's not weakness, that's intelligence. That's what witches have always done. So if you're been burning out, if you've been feeling like your magic is inconsistent or unreliable even, if you've been pushing yourself harder and harder trying to make things work, I want to have you consider that the problem isn't you, right? The problem is the model. The model that says you should be able to do it all yourself is broken. It was never true, and you don't have to keep living by it. Power doesn't come from intensity, it comes from regulation. And there's a difference between healthy outsourcing and healthy and unhealthy outsourcing. And learning to tell that difference is also part of the work. So healthy outsourcing looks like I said, borrowing momentum. It's not you're not borrowing identity. You're asking for support with something specific while still being able to be the one who does the work, who makes the choices, and who takes responsibility for the outcome. You're in collaboration, not this collapse. You open the door, you make the ask, and you close the door when it's done. The relationship has boundaries, it has reciprocity, and it has clarity, like Saint Expedite. When I petition Saint Expedite, I'm not handing my life over to him. I'm saying, hey, I need movement on this thing. I'm stuck. Can you help clear the path? And then I hold up my end. I make the offering. I do the work in the physical world too. I don't just light the candle and sit on my couch waiting for a miracle. The responsibility still stays with me. He's an ally, not a savior. That is healthy outsourcing. You're the witch, you're still steering, you're just not trying to push the car uphill by yourself when there's a whole team available. Now, unhealthy outsourcing looks different. This is when you stop developing your own skills because you figure the spirits will just handle it. And it's when you petition constantly but never build relationship, just take, take, take without reciprocity. And I'd really be curious to see which spirit would let someone do this for so long. But anyway, and so when you expect rescue instead of support, when the relationship replaces your agency instead of supporting it. And honestly, this can happen with anything. It can happen with deities, it can happen with saints, it can happen with tarot decks, with even other witchy friends and teachers and online communities. Any relationship, divine or human, can become unhealthy when it becomes a way to avoid your own responsibility and your own growth and power. But the danger isn't within the deities themselves or the saints or the gods or the ancestors. The danger is unexamined need. And when you're working from a place of desperation, when you haven't looked at why you're asking for what you're asking for, when you're trying to get something outside yourself to fix something only you can fix, that's when it starts to get murky. And that's when those old patterns start to creep back in. Because that's not a reason to avoid these relationships altogether. That's a reason to enter them with awareness and with your eyes open. So, really, when it comes to healing from this trauma, you ask yourself why. You ask yourself, why am I so afraid or fearful or just don't want to work with gods or deities, whether it's for you or not for you? I feel like we should all be asking those questions, right? Healing doesn't mean abandoning your boundaries. When you heal from this, it means your healing gets to evolve. It means those boundaries get to evolve, which is why, I don't know, 5 years ago, I would have never thought about working with a saint or deity. And now I'm like, it's fucking awesome. I love it. It means you get to revisit things you once rejected and ask, is this still true for me? Is this still a no? Or was that a no for then? And that doesn't have to be a no for now. So, really, to sort of wrap this all up, when it comes to working with these saints and deities, if you're hesitant and you ask yourself these harder questions and you're going through the work, trauma wants resolution now. It wants to be safe. It wants to know it's safe now, whereas discernment can tolerate uncertainty. If you can sit with, I'm not sure if this is trauma or discernment without panicking, without needing to decide immediately, that's actually a good sign. That's your nervous system regulated enough to be curious. So, I'm not telling you to work with saints. I'm not telling you to work with deities. I'm not telling you to do anything that doesn't feel right for you, of course, but I am asking you to check in with yourself to ask whether your no is a choice or if it's a reflex. Really, to ask whether you're avoiding something because it's genuinely not for you or because your body is still protecting you from something that isn't actually a threat anymore. Because really, if it is trauma, you can heal that. You can update that. You can renegotiate your relationship with power as you change. And if it's discernment, then you'll know and you can just trust it. So here is where we land. Power doesn't require belief, support doesn't require surrender, relationship doesn't require obedience. And really, post religious witchcraft isn't about proving how independent you are. It's not about proving how devoted you can be either. It's about choosing relationships with power that expand you instead of shrinking you, and that sustain you instead of draining you, that really support your craft without demanding this submission. And you want to get help without shame, right? You want to work relationally without kneeling. You get to revisit things you once rejected without betraying yourself. And sovereignty doesn't mean doing everything alone. That is a huge one. I think that gets like the biggest misunderstanding. It means choosing consciously, intentionally, with your eyes open, how power moves through your life. Now, after religion, you don't stop relating to forces larger than yourself. You just get to decide, maybe for the first time, what those relationships actually look like. So I hope something out of this conversation was very useful to every single one of you who tuned in, and I would actually would really love to hear how you work with deities. Maybe you're coming to working with deities in general, or saints if you work with any, and really just what your guys' experiences are, because I am so fascinated by the world of how other witches work with spirits compared to what it looks like in my witchcraft and my practice. And really, it's constantly evolving, and that's exciting. I love it when things change and when I get to explore new things and really dive deeper into something that I thought I already knew about. So, thank you everyone for joining me today. I am so grateful for everyone who follows and listens to the show. We are almost at 1,000 followers, which is honestly fucking insane. Like, I think honestly only 100 people away, especially right now. Just all the support I've gotten really makes a difference and centers me. So, as always, wherever you are in the world, I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, or night, and I hope to see you all back here next